This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel with a cattle market update. He explains how futures are still wild and why expansion is likely not going to be taking place soon. Forest Health Coordinator with the Kansas Forest Service, Ryan Rastok, continues the show by discussing why bush honeysuckle can be an issue for many in Kansas. Understanding how ponds might be leaking in today's show. Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, discusses possible solutions for producers who find their ponds are leaking. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week, we're joined by Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Derrell, what are we seeing for the cash markets right now in the cattle industry?
Well, cash markets, fed cattle have been pretty steady as we go forward. I wouldn't be surprised to see them gain a little bit of strength here in December, but that's more just based on history than what we've seen. It's obviously very early in the month, but pretty steady there. Feeder cattle markets, the bigger feeder cattle, so anything over 600 pounds, has been under some pressure in recent weeks, and that's related to kind of what's going on over in the futures market more than anything. In Oklahoma, at least, in our auction prices, the lightweight stocker calves have just continued, by and large, to move up. And, of course, that's based on a little bit smaller supplies this year, but also on relatively good demand that has developed as our wheat pasture grazing prospects have continued to improve over the last month or so.
And last week, we talked with Caitlin McCulloch from the Livestock Marketing Information Center, and she kind of describes the futures as being crazy. And are you continuing to see that this week?
Yeah, we have. This futures market had both live and feeder cattle have had a tremendous run up over the last several months based on a big built up long position from outside money. And the idea that we would see a correction and some profit taking in there was not a surprise. But once it started, it really snowballed. It was compounded by, go all the way back to the September cattle on feed report, which was pretty bearish, surprisingly large placements. We've had geopolitical events that have made everybody nervous. And so what we've had ultimately has been what I would consider a very overdone correction to the downside in these futures markets. They're pretty divorced from the fundamentals. All of the futures prices now are well below cash markets for both feeder and fed cattle. And so they will correct at some point. It seems to be taking a little bit longer to kind of turn that sentiment around. But I do look for these futures markets to stabilize and probably pick back up some here. And that'll help stabilize some of the pressure that has bled over into the feeder cattle markets in particular.
And Derrell, beforehand, you mentioned you'd been getting some questions from producers.
Yeah, obviously when we see this kind of correction on the futures and some of the impacts in the cash markets, it does lead to a lot of questions. And, I had a producer the other day who had heard my earlier outlook talks this year and basically said, well, so this changes your outlook. And I said, no, it really doesn't. The fundamentals in the market have not changed. The underlying numbers situation, the overall inventory numbers. And so, this again is just an overdone correction on the futures market. They do what they do, and they can do kind of anything for a while, but sooner or later they're going to have to respond to the fundamentals. And I think the fundamentals remain very strong for both feeder cattle and fed cattle markets.
And important also for the cattle market we usually talk about is boxed beef. And so what are you seeing there, Derrell?
Over the fall, boxed beef dropped a little bit from a little above $3 a pound or $300 a hundredweight for choice boxed beef. It's been running a little under that, so in the $295 or $297 to $299 range. It's holding pretty steady and actually looks to me like it's about ready to pick up a little bit. It wouldn't be surprising seasonally to see a little bit of strength build in that market, but certainly no major pressure there. Of course, overall beef production continues to decline, so that's providing some tight supply support for that market as well.
And talking from a few articles from your Cow-Calf Corner newsletter and talking about the cattle industry and how the inventories have kind of been changing in 2023.
Yeah, we came into 2023 from a long-term sort of cattle cycle perspective with a smaller beef cow herd again in 2023. And as we've gone through the year with the run-up in prices we've had, we sort of expect to see this thing stabilize and eventually, sort of turn around to some correction or to some herd rebuilding. But we have not seen that yet. Now, compared to last year, both beef cow slaughter and heifer slaughter are down. They've been up the last 2 years. And so they're off of those peak levels a little bit, but they're not off enough yet to suggest that we are actively, sort of retaining heifers, the kinds of things that would lead to eventually herd rebuilding, but in the short run, just stabilizing the herd. We're just not seeing that much yet.
Are those things you're hoping you see in 2024, or it's still a who knows game?
Well, to some extent, there's some unknowns. I mean, I really do expect to see it. I think the price incentives are there. And certainly once we get past this sort of futures market correction we've been talking about, I think the price incentives will regrow again, redevelop strongly in 2024. But, part of it comes down to the fact that we still have a lot of drought. And so some producers, the individual producers may still be forced to liquidate. The drought has kind of moved farther into the Delta and the lower Mississippi region. So it's affecting some newer producers, if you will, that weren't dealing with drought earlier. So there may be some of those impacts. Nationwide, I don't think the drought itself is leading to a lot of liquidation, but the numbers are already in place to say that we will have a smaller beef cow herd on January 1 of 2024. And then depending on what the drought does, in part, will determine whether or not we're able to stabilize. I don't think we see much growth in 2024, but we could at least sort of hold our own, if you will, through the year and maybe get some things in place that would make it possible to see some growth in 2025.
Other than just kind of hopefully coming out of the drought in 2024 or reducing the drought, what are some other key points that you think will be critical to retaining and then hopefully at some point expanding our cattle herds?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors that are playing into why we're not seeing much attempt to regrow yet, to rebuild the herd. The drought is certainly one of them. Part of it is drought recovery. Folks that may not still be in drought, but their resources need time, their pastures need time to heal up. That's part of it. A lot of it really is the aftermath of drought, as well as just generally high input cost. There's a lot of financial stress out there. And I've had a number of producers this fall in meetings just tell me, in the short run, I just really need to sell stuff. I need the revenue to sort of heal up financially. I can't really think about retaining heifers yet. As we go through another year, I think the price incentives will be there. And I think that expectation on the part of producers will change and they will begin to think about some heifer retention. But it may take another year almost from where we are right now.
And talking about moving things around, imports from Mexico kind of changing a little bit or not being the usual.
Well, they've really jumped this fall. I mean, they typically go up in the last part of the year, but part of it is that we're comparing to last year, which was a really low level. So the percentages really look big in terms of the year over year change in the last few weeks. Something like 40 to 50% higher. But again, last year was an unusually low level. So part of that is just the comparison base. But we are seeing an increase. And I think you can attribute that to really two factors. One is the high prices we have in the U.S. is going to attract cattle whenever they're available and possible. And so we typically would expect to see some additional cattle come in. The other thing is if you look at a drought map in Mexico, there's pretty widespread drought across Mexico that has developed in the last couple of months. And so that may be forcing some producers down there to go ahead and market calves, maybe even a little bit sooner than normal. And combine that with the opportunity to take advantage of high prices in the U.S., I think that's why we're seeing some increased flows of cattle from south of the border.
So overall, Derrell, are we just seeing tighter numbers, not just in the United States, but maybe in most of North America?
We have seen some tighter numbers. Drought has impacted in Canada. It's now impacting in Mexico as well. Again, we got a lot fewer cattle from Mexico last year. It's jumped back up a bit this year. Cattle numbers are generally tight, and that's going to continue to be a factor in the market, not only for feeder cattle prices and so on for producers, but also it affects the overall availability of cattle once we think about this question of herd rebuilding. And so, we've slaughtered a lot of heifers the last 2 to 4 years. And that is one of the reasons why it's going to take some time. Once we decide we want to rebuild the herd, it's not going to be a fast process. It's going to take some time to retain those heifers. And of course, with the biology of cattle, that's a slow process. By the time we grow them up, breed them, and get production out of them, that's going to take some time. And I think that's the situation that we're going to be in for the next several years.
As we look at the end of the year and are getting close to the start of a new one, what would you like to tell cattle producers when they think about their herd and think about the economics of it?
We're in this kind of no man's land between what's been forced on us in many cases, but with the drought, what we've had to do, very much a defensive kind of a position. I think a lot of producers now are in a position where they can start thinking about moving towards offense, if you will, to use that analogy, where we can think about where we want to be positioned. I think we're going to continue to see generally strong markets, not only in 2024, but for a year or two after that at least. And so I think producers want to think about how they need to be positioned in terms of their operation to take advantage of that. And, that's going to be different for different folks, but there will be opportunities here. Input prices remain relatively high, so cost of production is going to be a challenge. And profit potential will depend on managing costs as well as taking advantage of the revenues offered by the market.
Derrell, if people would like to read some of your articles from your Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, how could they do that?
Well, they're out there in a number of public venues, but you can also, if you'll search for Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, there's a place in there where you can ask to be put on the mailing list and get that newsletter directly. And I'd like to point out, I write an article every week, but I have several animal science colleagues that also provide some very good management information, production information as well. And so we're delighted to be able to bring that to people as they find it useful.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
You're very welcome. Anytime.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. I will link the Oklahoma State University's Extension's Cow-Calf Corner newsletter in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show discussing bush honeysuckle with Kansas Forest Service Forest Health Coordinator Ryan Rastok. Ryan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Ryan, what is bush honeysuckle?
So bush honeysuckle is a plant. It's kind of a shrubby type of plant. It can get fairly large, but think of it more as a large bush. And it's a plant that was introduced to the United States for horticultural purposes in the landscape and then in some wayward conservation practices in the 80s and 90s. And we have since learned that it has a propensity for kind of escaping cultivation or becoming what we'd consider invasive or detrimental to the surrounding environment.
So something that used to be beneficial but maybe looking to be a little bit more of an issue now?
Absolutely. And so when it was planted in the urban landscape in somebody's, garden or yard, it was more for an aesthetic concern because, they would have these red berries and, getting into the late fall and the winter, and then they'd have these pretty flowers, and then, they're green throughout much of the year. And so they were kind of planted for those purposes and then started kind of moving out into the woodlands and surrounding areas and kind of out of control and difficult to manage.
You mentioned a little bit about what they might be looking like at different times of the year. So kind of what do they look like now and how can people identify them?
Oh, it's awesome. And it's very, very simple to see it now because one of the interesting features of this plant is that its leaf phenology, or when the leaves come on or fall off, when they come on in the spring or fall off in the fall, they tend to have a longer window than our native trees. And so they'll tend to hold their leaves much later into the season. And so some of those throughout the state are still green, and then they'll drop them much later. And so if you're driving down the highway, I-70 or wherever, you'll see this kind of strip of green in the understory of the forest. And pretty much all of that this time of year would most likely be bush honeysuckle.
And is there a certain place people are likely to see them or really all across Kansas?
It's pretty extensive across Kansas, the eastern third for sure. And we do tend to see bush honeysuckle concentrations much higher around kind of urban epicenters or is planted in the landscape and stuff. And so, around your bigger towns and things of that nature, you tend to see it of a higher infestation in those areas.
So why is this something that maybe people should be caring about right now?
So what it does is it's very shade tolerant, and when it establishes in our native woodlands, primarily in the eastern third of the state or in our riparian corridors along the streams where we do naturally have trees throughout the state, it's very competitive, and so it can push out a lot of our native understory plants and woody vegetation or forbs and various other things because it's so competitive. And so in essence, it kind of, as it displaces multiple things, it replaces it with itself in kind of a monocrop. And so you get this quantifiable change in not only plant diversity but also the associated animals as well. And so we tend to see a degradation of the habitats associated with it.
Is this something that people are wanting to completely eliminate from their landscaping and everywhere, or might still see in landscaping and it's okay?
So I think it's pretty much out of the bag at this point. So complete eradication probably isn't practical. I don't know, and it can be very expensive and challenging to control. And so really you want to focus on those high priority areas, maybe in woodlands that are, of a higher quality or are actually native woodlands as opposed to, a grass field that's overgrown with, woody vegetation or something like that. And I don't know that we're necessarily going to see a cessation or a stop of the sales and planting of it because people do prefer that. But, to build that awareness that what we plant in the landscape does have surrounding impacts outside of our front yard or whatever that is.
How does this plant spread if it is just in a landscape or is just in a forest somewhere?
Yeah, so it's spreading through the fruits basically, and oftentimes through birds. And one interesting thing that I've personally noticed, and I think other people would agree, is when the birds will move it to a new area, the seeds will tend to kind of flow down the streams and stuff. That I've seen very high concentrations of bush honeysuckle along our streams, and so I think some of it's kind of moving down the water, and it'll get into the bank side where there's some disturbance. Especially if the soils are disturbed, they'll really be able to get in there and then germinate and establish. And like I mentioned earlier, they're very shade tolerant. So if a bird, picks up a few seeds, from your plant in the front yard and then goes out to a woodland and deposits it there, it can actually start to grow in those more shaded conditions where maybe some of our other plants struggle with that.
So thinking about control for this bush honeysuckle, what are a few chemical control options? Yeah,
so that gets to be very challenging to control, especially once it gets bad, right? So we're talking about a shrub that, say, for example, if you have a 10-acre area where the infestation is really bad, this can be wall-to-wall honeysuckle, 8-10 feet tall that you can barely even walk through. And so you have to be pretty creative with the type of control measures that you would use. And so sometimes we would defer to some chemical options if that's appropriate. And so there's any number of ways that you could do that, but really being sure to read the labels, and the label is the law. Wear your personal protective equipment so you're not needlessly exposing yourself. But in the really high infestations, it's not uncommon to have people use things like a mist blower at a certain time of year, say when the leaves are still on the bush honeysuckle and they've kind of fallen off of our native tree, so you get less off-target impacts, and so you can use that with a smaller concentration of glyphosate, but you want to be very, very cautious, and that's kind of a last-case scenario in my opinion. And we do have access to mist blowers if people would like to use those throughout the state. And you can contact your local, conservation district or NRCS office, or go to our website, kansasforest.org, and check those out. But in reality, that is kind of a last case scenario because it's a pretty extreme option there. So
something that is a little bit more labor intensive is that there are some mechanical control options.
So there's also some other kind of more mechanical controls, also in conjunction with chemicals, where you can physically go into an area, cut the plants and then treat the stumps. And you can see the chemical recommendation that we'd have on our website there. But that's very labor intensive. It can be very cathartic to see all the work that you've done. You see these just piles of honeysuckle that have been cut down, and then you treat the stumps, and that can be pretty effective, but pretty labor intensive. And then you're also still leaning on some chemicals there too.
For people who maybe are doing mechanical control along those rivers where you said you see higher concentration, are there things they need to be really careful of?
Oh, absolutely, especially considering chemicals. There are, if you're going to go that route, you really want to make sure that it's labeled for those areas so you're not contaminating the water, and then you're just using the prescribed label amount. And that can be challenging too, because another treatment method, these plants are really shallowly rooted, so you can actually pull them out of the ground pretty easily. But along these streams and riparian corridors, that's not really a tenable option, because if you start pulling them out of the ground, then you can actually get more erosion and kind of bigger issues there. So it can be pretty challenging to find that most ethical kind of option for controlling this thing.
And where can people find out some more information about the bush honeysuckle?
Yeah, so we have a forest health section on our website at kansasforest.org, and you can kind of peruse through there. And there's all kinds of other goodies in there, not just bush honeysuckle, but you can learn, all you want, or, email me at rrastok@ksu.edu, and be happy to answer any questions.
Ryan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us a little bit of information about bush honeysuckle.
Perfect. Thank you.
That was Kansas Forest Service Forest Health Coordinator Ryan Rastok. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain with an agriculture update.
The public now has opportunity to provide opinions on USDA's recently announced Regional Agricultural Promotion Program. As announced by Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack in mid-November,
we're publishing regulations in terms of how that program will work. We're opening up a 30-day comment period.
That Federal Register public comment period concluding on December 18th. Among those expected to offer comment, various agricultural trade organizations and commodity groups. What are some of their thoughts about RAP?
What it does is it allows us to keep up the pressure in terms of our marketing effort.
That view from Steve Mercer of U.S. Wheat Associates. One of the reasons for the interest in RAP is the timeliness of its announcement. USDA's Agricultural Trade Promotion Program, created in 2018 and operated by the Foreign Agricultural Service, is set to expire in 2024.
We were looking at a bit of a cliff. ATP is ending in June, so that extra funding is going to be gone. So it allows us to continue that work, to do more and more work promoting U.S. wheat around the world.
Joe Sheely of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, meanwhile, says he sees the Regional Agricultural Promotion Program serving in a similar capacity as ATP in regard to exploring new export markets and being more aggressive marketing and promotion-wise in emerging markets.
We have export promotions in a lot of established markets, and not just promoting meat, but opening up new doors and building relationships with importers, with distributors, with retail meat buyers, food service meat buyers. Some extra revenue really goes a long way when we're able to dive into especially some of the emerging markets.
Also like the Agricultural Trade Promotion Program, RAP is designed to serve as a complement to existing U.S. Farm Bill Ag Trade programs, such as the Market Access Program and Foreign Market Development Program. That is recognized by those in the export realm, such as Brent Boydston of the U.S. Grains Council.
What we've seen over the last several years, MAP and FMD funding, is as we've gone on in years, inflation and depreciation have brought that down, the value of it. So with USDA investing this money into the cooperator groups, I think you're going to see it put to use in these foreign markets, developing them.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, today talking about leaky ponds, and you're getting quite a few questions because people think their ponds are leaking.
Yeah, so we're in a drought condition in a lot of Kansas, or it's been a really dry year, and so a lot of ponds are naturally low. But, a lot of people have been calling thinking that it's because the ponds are leaking, and in some cases that is definitely happening. Ponds are leaking, but in a lot of cases it's just the conditions that we have. So I thought I'd chat a little bit about how can you tell if your pond is naturally low or if it has a leak and is something that needs a little bit of attention.
And what are a few different ways that ponds could be losing water?
Yeah, so, our water tables are really low right now because of the drought. So there's some seepage out of the sides of the pond mainly, maybe out of the bottom depending on the construction of the pond. But generally there's a clay layer at the bottom, and that does a pretty good job of holding the water. There's definitely a lot of seepage around the sides of the pond. And so seepage is when that water leaves the pond and goes into the ground. That's one main way. Evaporation is another one. And so ponds can lose 2 to 3 inches of surface water a week just to evaporation going up into the air. And so, if you think about that over the period of a month or so, if we're not getting any rain, you can definitely notice that change in the amount of water that you have in your pond. So time of year, different weather conditions all factor into the amount of water that you're going to be losing in your pond. So there are natural ways that our ponds lose water.
For those people whose ponds are actually leaking, what is a way that they might be able to identify that leak?
A couple key characteristics of a leaky pond. One of them is, ponds that are leaking tend to fill up quickly after a rain. And then when they fill up, there's something called hydrostatic pressure, which is all that water pushing down on the water at the bottom of the pond. And that tends to force water out of small cracks and things like that. And so what you'll see is your pond will rise up, it'll fill up, and then it'll quickly, after a rain, drop back down to a certain level. And every time you get a big rain, it'll kind of do that. It'll fill up and it'll drop back down to that level. That level is just when the hydrostatic pressure isn't strong enough anymore to push that water out. So that's when it stops leaking. So if you see your pond fill up after a rain and drop down very quickly within a day or so, that's a good indication of a leak. Another thing that you can do is inspect your dam. Going to the back side of your dam, the side away from the pond, you can look at the back of it and look for a bright green area where vegetation is getting more water than the areas around it. There might be areas that are really wet or soggy. That'd be another indication, especially in the dry conditions that we have. So really just kind of looking at your pond and looking at the dam to see, hey, are there any areas that maybe water is sneaking through?
If those people have identified that their pond is leaking, what are a few things that they could possibly do?
There are products that you can put in the pond. A lot of people ask about bentonite, and so bentonite works really good in the bottom of a pond when it's being constructed. Bentonite, for it to work well, has to be mixed in with the clay and compacted, and so a lot of people try to go out and just sprinkle some bentonite on the pond, and that doesn't work very well. And so I don't recommend bentonite unless you're in the construction phase. In the construction phase, that works really well. If you can identify where your leak is, there are products called cross-link polymers, and there are two main products on the market. Soil Flock and Dammit are the two main products. They kind of work like spray foam insulation, but for water. And so you sprinkle the product in the water, it gets pushed down into the cracks, and then it swells up and kind of fills in those cracks. And so that works really well if you know where your leak is. The products are expensive, and so if you have to treat an entire pond or something like that, it would quickly get to just be too much money for the gain that you'd get. So you need to be able to identify your leak there. To figure out where your leak is, you probably need to call an expert, and they'll figure out exactly where that leak is. So something we want to think about.
Sometimes, is it worth just building a new pond?
Yeah, that's often the cheapest remedy is to break your dam and start over, somewhere else, generally downstream. Well, I see that a lot with people that let trees grow up on dams. And so when trees get really big, their roots grow through the dam. When those trees die, they can decay to the point that they're just basically allowing a big open area for that water to drain out. When you get into that situation, it's generally cheaper to just break your dam, get rid of the pond that you have, and start over somewhere else if you can.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you this Monday on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.